real quickly because the reason why we always have extra study, usually up until COVID-19, we would have a series of 5, 6, 7 classes, one after the other tonight. And it would be at synagogue. We'd have an open meal. And we usually get about 100 people. And the idea is that the children of Israel fell asleep at the giving of the Torah. And we had to be woken up. And what an embarrassment, such an important day. And we all were sleeping in. So to show our enthusiasm for the anniversary of the giving of the Torah, we do a tikkun. We fix that which is broken. We fell asleep and we were groggy, so we stay up all night and we study extra Torah. That being said, we want to thank Ahuva for not only tonight, but every week she gives a series of classes, and they're very well attended, and she helps bring Torah to our community, to our shul, and to Israel. So Ahuva, thank you, and we're all looking forward to tonight's class.
Okay, so we all know that during the Shavuot day, we read the book of Ruth, and our sages, rabbis tell us a few reasons for it. First one, that it's actually the birthday and the Yortzeit of King David. And the book of Ruth, records the ancestry of King David, since Ruth and her husband Boaz were actually King David's great-grandparents. Second reason they tell us it's because it's the season of harvesting, and it describes in the book is very appropriate because that describes the harvest. And the third one is that Ruth was a very sincere convert who embraced Judaism with all her heart. And on Shavuot, we as Jews also, what we did is basically made converted. We have accepted the Torah and all of its laws. So this is like the more common explanation on why we reached Megillat Ruth. I'd like to touch on some other things as well. So what's the story behind Megillat Ruth? So if we look at the book of Ruth in terms of its subject matter, which is, it very much reminds us of another book, which I would say is probably the Bereshit, the book of Genesis. And why am I saying that? Because it's a tale of ordinary human beings demonstrating very extraordinary gifts and strength of character, just like the same as we see in Genesis. Our sages asked, why was the book of Ruth written altogether, since it contains no laws and nothing about what is pure and impure, or laws of what to do, or what's permitted, what's forbidden, of kashrut, of any kind. So in Hebrew they go, lama nichteva, why was it written altogether? So, and they say it was written to tell us of the reward of people who perform acts of kindness, and therefore it reminds us of the book of Genesis as well. Both books are very similar in kind of a tone, they say, very similar in the subject matter. For example, when we read certain passages in Ruth, it kind of reminds us of Bereshit. For example, when Boaz and Ruth meet, Boaz says to Ruth, I've been told of all you did for your mother-in-law after your husband died, and you left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and you traveled to a people that you didn't know before, prior. So what does that remind us of? Obviously, Avraham in Parashat Lech Lecha in Bereshit. Avraham leaves all that is familiar to him and sets out on a journey as asked by God or as told by God. Ruth does exactly the same thing. She leaves her family and her land, and she sets out to an unknown journey. Ruth is a kind of a female, almost like I would say a female counterpart to Avraham Avinu. The book of Bereshit is also considered to be like a prelude to the birth of the Jewish people. Bereshit is a book of family. Throughout its family of Abraham and Sarah and Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, Rachel, Leah, the children, the tribes, and all of that. But there is no really nation yet. It's like a prelude to the nation. It's from those individual families who represent the prelude to the birth of that nation. And similarly as Ruth, but Ruth is a prelude to something else. She's a prelude for a king. Until Ruth, Israel has been really a federation of tribes. Ruth has taken us to a time from a tribal society, which is not only unified, not a unified nation yet, to the birth of Israel as being a strong kingdom. Although because starting even before King Saul. So there is more connection between the book of Ruth and the book of Bereshit, as we see. The biggest surprise, though, is like towards the end of the book of Ruth, where we find a remarkable parallel between the two, seemingly distant biblical stories. And which are they? There are times we say when sometimes we read a parasha in the Torah and we get the feeling that the text reminds us of something or resonates something or echoes another biblical text. And in the case of the story of Ruth and Boaz, on the one hand, and the episode of Yehuda and Tamar in the book of Genesis on the other, this is exactly what happens. The connection begins as we identify references to Yehuda and Tamar episode clearly in at least two places in Megillat Ruth. First, when the town folks bless Boaz on his impending marriage to Ruth, where it says, let your house be as the house of Peretz, who Tamar bore to Yehuda, through the offspring of God will give you by this young woman, meaning by Ruth. Later on, at the end of the book, we find another reference to Peretz, where when we are given the genealogical list, which connects of King David, which connects Boaz and Ruth to King David. However, rather than starting the intergenerational chain from Boaz in Megillat Ruth, because that's what Megillat Ruth is all about, right? It starts the list from Peretz. Peretz is the son of Yehuda. Why? What's the focus about that? Peretz is really an anonymous character. He never features on any independent personality. Nothing special in the Torah. Nobody ever really mentions much about him. What is the connection here? And why of all books mentioned in the book of Ruth? So to help us understand, I would like to look a little bit really fast into the background of the two stories, and then we'll put it together. So the first mention of Peretz is found in, like I said, in the book of Genesis, chapter 38, and in the middle of the story of Joseph, okay? And it all starts with Yehuda, who was leaving there, Judah was leaving his brothers, and it was at that time that Judah went down from his brothers, and there Judah saw the daughter of a merchant. Her name is Shua, who was a Canaanite, and he takes her and he comes to her, which means the language expressed in the Bible for being married. Judah has three sons, Onan, and Shelah, and Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name is Tamar. Of course, Tamar, Canaanite also. Now, Judah's firstborn, was evil, supposedly, in the eyes of the Lord. That's how the Torah expresses it. And the Lord put him to death. He died. And Judah says to Onan, come to your brother's wife, because you need to perform now the rite of the Yibum. Yibum, when the brother-in-law marries the widow if she had no children, and raise up offsprings for your brother. But Onan clearly does not want her to have a child who will be seen as the child of his dead elder brother. Now Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, supposedly, and it came about when he came to his brother's wife that he wasted his semen, meaning he threw it on the ground, and in order not to give seed to his brother. So that angers Hashem very much. And guess what? He's dead. Having lost two of his children now, Judah kind of refuses to let Tamar marry his youngest child. Obviously, also, he was very young and he had no intention of marrying her. And but not only that he's not willing to have her marry him, he does not really release her, and she becomes what we call an aguna, a chained woman, okay? So, which means that if eventually he does decide to marry her, she's available to him. Eventually, as you know, if you don't know the story, we're getting like it's a X-rated movie here. She dresses up as a prostitute. She stations herself in a particular juncture of the way. And when Yehuda comes from his sheep shearing, he takes her to be a prostitute, and he lies with her. He wants to pay her. He can't pay her. He has no money. She says, okay, give me your staff and your ring as a pledge for payment. Eventually, he comes back the next day to pay for the sum. Guess what? She's not there. He asks around. Nobody knows of any prostitute that has ever been in that district. Later, he discovers that Tamar has become pregnant. Judah assumes she got pregnant by some strange person, not a part of the family. And since she is bound to Shea, to his son, by the laws of Yibum, her pregnancy is considered to be or that of an adulterous union, and Judah has her brought out and sentenced to death. With great tact, Tamar comes without saying a word, just brings out the stuff and the seal and says, I'm pregnant to the one that these two things belong to. That moment, Judah realizes everything that she's done, and he realizes that he is the father. And it says, and it came about when she gave birth that the infant stretched out his hands. So the midwife took a band of crimson thread and put it around him. But guess what? That was not the one. And this one, she said that will be a sign that this one came out first. But then what happened, it came about that he drew back his hand, and behold, his brother emerges. And she said, with what strength you have come out. And Judah names him Peretz, Peretz meaning in Hebrew, to break through, to breach through. And that's who Peretz is. That moment, the future of the family is secured. Now let us look at the story of Ruth. Story of Ruth begins with, now it came to pass that in these days, in the time of the judges, there was a famine in the land, and the men went to Bethlehem he sojourned in the fields of Moab, and he and his wife Naomi and his two sons. And they, the two sons, married two Moabite women, one named Orpha and the other one, our famous Ruth. Both sons died. We don't really know the reason for their death. It kind of left kind of a hidden story, but the rabbis and the Midrash tell us that the answer might be hidden in their names, which both names are kind of indicative of sickness and destruction. Machlon comes from the word machala, sickness. Chilion comes from destruction. Ruth now is again a young widow. After her husband's death, she chose to continue, though, as we know, living with her former mother-in-law, Naomi, who was also a widow. Why is it not? I'm sorry, Isaac, after her husband's death, she chose to continue living with her former mother-in-law, Naomi, who was also widowed.
Yes.
Ruth, as I mentioned earlier, was a Moabite, which she was a foreigner. Yet when she opted to remain Naomi's companion, she stated, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God, the famous words. So she swore her allegiance to the lonely older woman who was heartbroken over the total loss of her family, her husband, her children. The two traveled from Moab to Naomi's home, back to Naomi's home, just at the time of the harvest of the barley just starting. These women had no men to provide for them, but Ruth, not so stupid, and she suggested that she goes around to the field and goes and sees how she can collect some of the barley left by the harvesters. You know that God had commanded that the landowners leave always anything that the harvesters didn't pick up, so that the poor, the widow, the foreigner, the orphans have a supply for food, can go and pick it up. So Ruth just so happened to glean in a field, and it so happened to be owned by a man named Boaz, who happens to be a relative of Naomi's dead husband, no less. When Boaz came out to see how the harvesters fare, he notices Ruth and he asks about her, and learning that she was a hard worker, he pulled her aside, and when she found out who she was as well, and gleaned alongside his servant girls, this way to make sure that she doesn't get hurt by anybody and by the guys that were working around. God forbid she should be molested by anybody. And Boaz gave Ruth freedom also to drink from his water jars as she was working there. And this was an extraordinary treatment. Ruth was stunned and she asked the man, why you gave me such a, because you're so kind to me. And Boaz responds to her and he says that he has heard that Ruth's devotion to Naomi and how she felt her homeland to be she left her homeland to be a companion for Naomi, for her weary mother-in-law, and he admired her newfound faith, the fact that she took into the Jewish faith. And Boaz blessed Ruth, saying to her, may you be richly rewarded by God, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. He went on then to feed her from his own table and to make sure his harvesters left behind the choice grain for her to pick up. Now she comes to Naomi, she shares the story with her, and Naomi suggested that Ruth act on the custom of the day, which allowed the young woman to call upon her nearest male relative to serve as a kinsman redeemer, ibum. A kinsman redeemer would buy back Ruth and Naomi's dead husband's land, as well as become Ruth's new husband. As instructed, Ruth makes herself beautiful, goes out in the evening to the place where Boaz and his men were working. Boaz goes to sleep. The middle of the night, she joins him. She uncovers his feet. Again, X-rated, beautiful feature here, and lay down near him. In the middle of the night, he awoke and he saw her and he asked, who are you? And she said, oh, I guess must have been very dark. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. Again, Boaz reacted kindly to Ruth, blessing her and noting that she did not run after the younger men that were there. Whether they were rich or poor didn't matter. He assured her, don't be afraid, all my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character, and he promised to care and for her and to act on her request. One rule stood in the way. Ruth had one nearer male relative, actually, and or better say Naomi or her husband, and he has no name. It's called Ploni Almoni. Ploni Almoni in Hebrew is the nameless one, somebody just there, who had first rights to buy the land that belonged to her to Naomi as part of the family of Elimelech and Naomi's husband. And Boaz, the fair man that he was, he says he would give this man the opportunity to buy the land and marry Ruth, the first right. Long story short, the man was very interested in the land, but not so much in Ruth, so he opted out of both. And Boaz and Ruth got married, and Ruth gave birth to a son, and they called his name Oved. And he is the father to be of Ishai, who was King David's father. So you can now see the connection between the story of Tamar and the story of Ruth. Both stories begin by somebody moving away from the rest of the Jewish family. Elimelech and his own sons go to Moab. They leave their people. Both stories begin with a physical decline. When you go out of Israel, it's vayered. It's yored. It's you go down. You go down emotionally. You go down physically. You go down spiritually. Both beginning with the senior male Judah and Elimelech leaving their people. Who are the real movers and shakers in both stories? The women. They are the ones who make everything happen. They begin with the same narrative. 2 sons die to Judah's 2 sons, Er and Onan, and Elimelech's 2 sons, Machlon and Chichlon. Both women is left in both cases as a childless widow, and both of them are unable to undergo the standard form of lever marriage of Yibum. In the case of Judah, he won't let the younger son marry Tamar. And in the case of Ruth, what does Naomi tell Ruth? Go back to your family because you know I'm too old and there's no chance for me to have another child. And even if I do, it would be so long before he would be grown up for you to be married to him that it's useless. So in the case of Tamar, we see she gets pregnant. Who she gets pregnant by? By her father-in-law. We must mention that the Ramban points out that this was a form of Yibum marriage before the giving of the Torah. It was acceptable, that it wasn't restricted to brother-in-law, but any male within the family. So this was known as a normative form of Yibum at that time. In the case of Ruth, she's marrying Boaz, and Boaz picks this law. You know, it's very interesting with that unknown man, which says that if you get to buy the field, you got to marry the woman. A common law rather than a biblical law. But one way or another, Ruth also turns on to the unconventional form of Yibum marriage because Boaz is also not her closest relative. In the case of Tamar, it was son number 3, Shelah, that was supposed to be married to her. In the case of Ruth, probably was that Ploni Almoni, that Mr. Anonymous. So in both cases, the person nearest to performing the duties is somehow not going to do it, not going to perform that duty. In both cases, why does Tamar and why does Ruth also want to have a child altogether? Okay, and it's a beautiful term in Hebrew that says lehakim shem hamet, to make sure that the name of the dead husband is perpetuated by having a child who will carry his lineage forward. Both Tamar and Ruth seem to demonstrate a determination to see that this becomes a reality. Interestingly, the term of Yibum appears in the entire Tanakh twice, actually maybe 3 times. The one time is the first time when the practice is actually mentioned in the book of Devarim, but other than that, as really something that's really happening and taking place, only twice. And this is in these 2 places, these 2 stories, the story of Tamar, like I said, in the book of Genesis, chapter 38, and in the story of Ruth in the book of Ruth. So both are mindful of the moral duty to perpetuate that name of the dead. And of course, both have to do rather daring acts to make it happen. Like I said, some X-rated stories, Tamar dressing up as a prostitute, Ruth coming to Boaz in the middle of the night and spreads his cloak over herself. And these are truly very, very daring acts. Also here we have 2 women who are the ultimate outsiders. Although to be a woman did not exactly immediately at that time give you any entry to great power, the Torah is telling us here that it is women who really matter. It's they who have that moral courage. Although both of them widows, don't forget the vulnerability of the widow that we always talk about, at every festival you had to include the stranger, the orphan, the widow. Both women are childless. each case, there is an attempt to discourage them from fulfilling their role in continuing the line and the name of their dead husbands also through the practice of Yibum. There's always an argument that the potential candidate is not yet grown up, like we hear in Tamar, Judah saying, said to his daughter-in-law, stay. Judah said to his daughter-in-law, stay a widow in your father's house until Shelah eventually grows up. And Ruth, Naomi says, like we know, turn back, my daughter, for I am too old to be married, and so forth and so forth. So both women come from the least favorite nations in for the Israelites. Tamar comes to be as a Canaanite, and Ruth as a Moabite. Two women at the very, very margin of society who nonetheless emerge as two heroines. They are the people who allow the Jewish story to continue, as we read at the end of the book of Ruth, where it lists the genealogy, the family tree of King David, which begins with Peretz. We are told that there's 10 generations from Adam to Noach. There are 10 generations from Noach to Avram, and there are 10 generations from Peretz to King David. Who is listed number 1? The parents of Peretz, Judah and Tamar. Who is number 7? The key spot here, Ruth and Boaz. The Torah finds it important for us to understand about King David's background, his family background. Who does it tell us were the key figures in this whole story? Tamar and Ruth. Despite the fact that initiation of the Yibum process would appear to fall upon the men in each of the story, we see that the women are the ones who take matters in their own hands in rather unconventional ways, we might say, but in order to bring about the desired result. In each story, the man is passive in this regard, but the women are the ones that take the initiative. It is from these ultimately disregarded simple figures that come the character and the strength that marks King David, Israel's greatest king. So what are we learning from this? The whole story of King David is telling us that he is the one person who no one thought of him to be as a king. When the story goes that God tells Samuel to go to, that he was displeased at the time with King Saul, and he sends him to take, that he's planning to take the kingship away from him, and he tells him to go to the house of Ishai. And he tells him, there you will find the next king. He goes to the house of Ishai, and Ishai has multiple boys, sons, and he goes and brings the first one who sure looks like a king. And God goes to him, no, that's not the one. So they go and they bring the other 7 sons, and God says, no, that's not the one. Because what it is was God does not look at the outer appearances. He didn't care what they looked like. God looked to the heart, and Samuel goes through all of these sons, and not one of them is pleasing to God. He asks Ishai, have you got anyone else there? And Ishai answers reluctantly, okay, yeah, there's this little one, David, you know, is the little kid, he's out there, he's looking after my sheep. Go bring him. And God says to Samuel, that is your man. Judaism is telling us that heroes are not born necessarily heroes. Just because you were born to royalty, it does not make you royal. Heroes are made, and they are sometimes made by the women who are responsible of the family tree. Because what Tamar and Ruth share in common is very simple: loyalty and kindness. And that is what God wants. He does not look for a military hero. He can make one. He doesn't want miracle workers. He can make his own. He doesn't want a high priest who has no contact with the people. He needs one that will have that contact. He wants someone who will be loyal to his people, somebody who will be willing to make sacrifices, to take risks for the sake of the people, for the sake of the community, and the continuity of the people. And that is what the Torah is leading to. This is what we got from these two remarkable women. It is their moral courage that allowed King David to become the really courageous king that he was, and at the same time, the infinitely vulnerable human being that he was. Here is a man who united Israel, made Jerusalem the capital of Israel, fought wars, won them by the hundreds of thousands, we are told, and courageous strength. He worked the plans to build our temple, but he also was the man who wrote the Psalms, the most intimate, most insight into the vulnerability of the human soul that has ever been written. This he got from these two women. He teaches us, don't stereotype. God has to distribute, God has so distributed gifts for human character that they can appear whenever or wherever you least expect. Never write anyone off just because of who they are, what their name is, where their origin is, where their ethnic origin, where they were born, who they were born to. The people, sometimes the ones that you least expect, may surprise you the most. In conclusion, I would like to say, so we have these two preludes, two stories, and they're telling us something very important, that even though the rest of the books of the Torah after Genesis are about the birth of Israel as a nation, and even though the books of Samuel, the books of Kings are about the birth of Israel as a kingdom, they are intensely very political books. While the book of Genesis and the book of Ruth is telling us of the prime importance of the personal over the political. It teaches us that we cannot believe that we can just run politics by politics alone. We cannot politicize everything. A society depends on acts of kindness, acts of generosity, moral strength. Those human values told in simple stories, stories of families and their hardships and the strength that it gets them through those struggles. They are the things that matter, those little things. It is human model values that count most of all. Do not try to build a political system without a moral foundation of love and kindness within and beyond the family. That's a very profound thing, and that is a setting of the book of Ruth as a whole. So why the book of Ruth on Shavuot after we mentioned the other three? The time of receiving on the Torah, remember we mentioned those three reasons, where there is one more. It was because Ruth and Matan Torah, the time of the Torah, receiving the Torah, represent an ideal balance. The grand event of Matan Torah, as grand as it was, represents a national commitment to God and Torah. It's between Adam Lamakom, it's between men to God. An event extraordinary. The story of Ruth is a perfect counterbalance. Story of a few private, very modest individuals who also demonstrate absolute commitment. Commitment here is to people, to human dignity, to the values of Ben Adam lechavero, between one man to the other, which plays a pivotal role in Judaism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ahuva. Excellent, excellent. We're very, very honored. Rabbi Josh has likewise prepared an amazing class. Ahuva, thank you. Always providing us with great insights from a different perspective other than a male's approach. Excellent. Thank you, Ahuva. Rabbi Josh?
Ahuva. Great.
Thank you.
Microphone is
Amazing.
yours.
Okay, everybody, let's get to it. So my class is titled Epidemics and the Jewish Community, Ein Davar Chadash Tachat Hashamesh, which is a famous quote from the book of Kohelet, there is nothing new under the sun. The Jewish people have always dealt with epidemics. whether you want to call it a virus, a pandemic, an epidemic, a plague, and we have always found ways to deal with it and to persevere. And as it looks like we are beginning to see the light from this pandemic and re-emerge, we have to also take comfort in the fact that throughout our history, we have also been strong following a pandemic, and it's only made us both as a community and as individuals stronger. So I thought it was very appropriate to share that with you. Let's dive right in because I've prepared a lot and I'm under the clock. It says here, the first biblical figure to shelter in place was Noah. If you think about it, when Noah was in the ark, at the end, when he's coming out of the ark, Hashem says to him, but for your own lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. Meaning, once you come out, we're going to have a reckoning. I will require it of every beast of man too. I will require a reckoning of every man for that of his fellow man. And Hashem tells Noah, the plague is over. You know what you have to do? Famously, Pru urvu shirtzu ba'aretz urvuva. Be fertile and multiply, abound on the earth and increase on it. So come out with positivity and come out and start making the world again. Rabbi Bradley Shavit Artson from the American Jewish University in Los Angeles comments that Noah had to shelter in place because the world around him is too deadly. And he has to prepare for a world that's going to be radically unlike the world he left. But there's a kind of faithfulness to knowing that you can enter into the ark and that you will go out again one day. Just like us, a year ago, we were really sheltered in place. We were almost on our own ark, not able to go out at all. But things are changing quickly, and we know we've already gone out, and things are going to get better like it did for Noah. We look at the book of Shemot in Exodus. They were told to shelter in place in their homes. For that night, I will go through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and I will mete out punishment to all the gods of Egypt, I, the Lord. And the blood of the houses where you are staying shall be a sign for you. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. That's the name of the holiday, so that no plague will destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And of course, we know it did strike the land of Egypt, and there was no house where there was not someone dead. We all know this, but maybe we all know this, obviously, but maybe we haven't thought of it in terms of how it affects us and how it's similar to what we've been going through. I read an article by Professor Leanne Feldman, who's a professor of Jewish studies at the Jewish Center, the Skirball Center at NYU, and she writes, of course, avoiding an avenging angel is hardly an exact parallel to avoiding the risk of a viral infection, but the principle is the same. For the ancient Israelites, staying inside one's home is designed to protect them from being killed by the plague that is sweeping through the country just outside their door. However, simply staying inside is not enough in this story. The plague can enter homes and kill its inhabitants. This is why God tells the Israelites to mark their doorways with blood to set them apart. Scholars understood the blood-making ritual to function atropically, which is to say, the ritual serves to ward off evil spirits and demons. Call it Clorox for the ancient dwelling. In order for the ancient Israelites to protect themselves from the plague sweeping Egypt, they had to mark their homes so they would be protected. But what did the Israelites do as they waited out the plague? Like many of us today, they cooked. They weren't just sitting there, right? They lived. In the story of the first Passover in Egypt, each Israelite household has to roast a lamb and divide it with their neighbors, and if they couldn't eat a whole one. While locked inside their homes, they cooked and ate the meal and waited out the passing of the plague. It's just similar to what we did on Pesach last year, right? We didn't just say there's no Pesach this year. No, we lived and we cooked. The next book in the Torah, and Vayikra. Vayikra is the whole book of Vayikra is very concerned with Tameh and Tahor, with ritually pure and ritually impure. And in chapter 13, it says, Kol yemei asher hanega bo yitma tamehu. He shall be unclean as long as the disease is upon him. Being unclean, he shall dwell apart. his dwelling shall be outside the camp. So when they thought that perhaps the person might have a disease, and it talks about tsarat, leprosy, and other diseases, that he had to dwell outside the camp, right? This is the first quarantine in the Torah. And it also appears as though afflicted people were also required to veil their mouths. Sounds similar? It was the first mask, right? It says, as for the person with the, it says leprosy here, but that's an old translation, probably was not leprosy. As for the person with the tsarua affliction, his clothes shall be rent, his head shall be left bare, and he shall cover over his upper lip. There's the mask, right? And he shall clean out, he shall call out, tameh, tameh, unclean, unclean. Look at all the parallels in Torah along the 3,000 plus years ago to what we've been going through. Rabbi David Wolpe, very famous conservative rabbi in Los Angeles, writes the following. It's so interesting and unknowable what the ancient mind understood and assumed about the transmission of disease. But clearly it was particularly terrifying because they didn't know. Jews of antiquity intuited that touching objects could spread contagion. And in other parts of Vayikra, they talk about the utensils. If you touched a utensil, utensils could also become ritually impure or diseased, and they also had to be left to become clean again. And their priest instructed them to wash or burn clothes thought to have been infected. The deep truth of the Torah is that everything has changed since the time of the Torah, but human nature, so that when confronted with new challenges, our emotional and spiritual reactions are the same. In the Navi, in the Book of Kings, which is around 700 BCE, the Assyrian king Sancherib was on a campaign to reassert control over his vassal kings in the land of Israel, so he laid siege to Yerushalayim. His army, known for its ferocity, inexplicably stopped short of conquering the city. What happened? Vayhi b'layla, and it was in the middle of the night, an angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 the Syrian camp, and the following morning they were all dead corpses. A plague, a virus came. It was one of the great miracles in Navi, and the Assyrians were defeated and did not capture the land of Israel at that time. These are just one of many examples in the Torah and the Tanakh that I highlighted to show that contagion, plague, disease has always been a big part of what Jewish people have dealt with. In the Talmud, we have the very famous story of Rabbi Akiva's students. And I'll stop the share for 1 second. I like stopping the share so I can look at you every so often. We all know that during Sfirat HaOmer, which we finished tonight, with that for either the first 33 days or counting backwards from 33 days, we mourn by not shaving, weddings, haircuts, for the deaths of 24,000 of Rabbi Akiva's students. And many of us know that they died. The rabbinic tradition is they spoke Lashon Hara. They were not nice to each other. There are those who think they fought in the Bar Kokhba battles. But the Gemara actually discusses what happened to the students. They seemingly had a virus, a disease, a plague that struck them. But let's learn it directly from Masecha Yevamot 62b. I'll just do the English, not the Aramaic. With regard to the 12,000 pairs of Rabbi Akiva students, the Gemara adds, it is taught that all of them died in the period from Pesach until Shavuot. Rav Chama bar Abba said, and some say it was Rabbi Chia bar Avin, they all died a bad death. The Gemara inquires, what is it that was called such a mita ra'ah, such a bad death? They say the askara. They don't say what the askara was, but the rabbinic commentators are pretty united that it was some kind of croup. Croup is usually caused by some kind of diphtheria. And I know we have some doctors on here. I saw Dr. Rosenzweig a second ago, but let me see. But we all know that the main symptom, I don't see him right now, but you know the main symptoms of those things, of croup, for example, is respiratory issues. You eventually die from oh, there's Dr. Gloria, right, Dr. Gloria? So you die from terrible coughing and distress from the lungs, which is, right? Is that correct?
Correct. You can't get air in.
Can't
There's swell.
get air in, right? That sounds similar to what the people during COVID-19 were suffering from as well. And so it's very specific. It seems very similar to what we've been experiencing. Okay, sorry, I have a bad habit of sharing and unsharing. But this class really meant to be a survey of how Ein Davar Chadash Tachar Hashamash. This has happened many times before. The Talmud, like the Bible, views epidemics as divine punishment for wrongdoing. But at the same time, the rabbis were also exposed to Greek medical thought and had an understanding of hygiene and preventative health that was way ahead of its time. The Talmud is very strict regarding hand washing. Even today, every religious boy and girl is taught from a very early age to bench Nagelwasser and to have a bowl and a cup under their bed. For those of you who wash shtisel, you saw they all did it. The first thing you do when you wake up, even before anything, maybe if you have to go to the restroom, you do that. But besides that, you wash your hands and you say the bracha al netilat yadayim. When you go to the bathroom, you wash your hands again, and then you say the bracha asher yatzar. This is long before anybody knew about germs or even knew that hygiene was a way to be healthy. Our Masorah, our tradition was way ahead of medical science in that regard by thousands of years. The Gemara says in Masechet Sota 4b. We'll do the English. Some of this I just found very interesting. Whenever just like Ahuva mentioned some X-rated things, whenever the Gemara has some juicy topics, we like to, we're not bashful about it. It says, concerning anyone who eats bread without washing his hands, it is as if he engaged in sexual intercourse with a zona, with a prostitute, as it is stated in the book of Proverbs, for on account of a harlot, a man is brought to a loaf of bread. So it's equal. The avera, the sin of eating bread without washing is the same thing as having sex with a prostitute. Rabbi said this phrase for on account of a zona, a man is brought to a loaf of bread, is not how the verse presents this idea. It should have been the opposite. On account of a loaf, a man is brought to a harlot. Rather, Rabbi says the verse should be interpreted as follows. Anyone who engages in sexual intercourse with a harlot will eventually be reduced to poverty and beg people for a loaf of bread. Moral of the story, don't go to a prostitute. Okay, the Gemara continues its discussion of washing hands. Rav Zrika says, Rabbi Elazar said, anyone who treats the ritual of washing hands with contempt is uprooted from the world. And there's this rabbinic discussion there that people were lax about it. No one understood hygiene. They didn't want to really wash their hands, or they wanted to eat, right? The rabbis insisted, no. If you are lax about it, if you kind of treat it with as a kind of a joke, you'll die. You'll be uprooted from the world. It's questionable whether it's historically accurate, but we've long been taught that Jews died less in the Black Plague and other diseases because we were so strict in washing our hands all the time. There's some who dispute that, but it's certainly we certainly know that's the way to avoid disease, and we've been washing our hands for a very, very long time. And Baba Kama 60b. Tanu Rabbana, the rabbis teach, it says, if there is a plague in the city, gather your feet, i.e. limit the time you spend out of the house, so it's the opposite of what we learned in COVID, as it is stated, and none of you shall go out of the opening of his house until the morning. Don't go out of the house, stay in the house. And it says in another verse, come, my people, enter your chambers and shut your doors behind me. So it tries to give biblical proof texts for the fact that you should limit the time you go outside of the house. If there is a plague in the city, stay in the house. It's exactly what we did. Shelter indoors was long the advice from the Talmud thousands of years ago. And on the same page of the Talmud, it says, at a time when there was a plague, Rava would close the windows of his house, as it is written, for death is come up into our windows. This was sage advice from the rabbis. One more, in Ketubot, it says, another tractate of the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan would announce, Be careful of the flies found on those afflicted with ratan, which was a terrible disease at the times of the Gemara, as they are carriers of the disease. Rabbi Zera would not sit in a spot where the wind blew from the direction of someone afflicted with ratan, because they thought that the virus was airborne. Rabbi Elazar would not enter the tent of one afflicted with ratan, and Rabbi Ami and Rabbi Asi would not eat eggs from an alley in which someone afflicted with ratan lived. Conversely, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi would attach himself to them and study Torah, saying the Torah, so this is the opposite. He said, no, Torah would protect them. Torah is a loving hind and a grateful dove. It bestows grace on those who learn it. Does it not protect them from illness? This is similar to the class that I gave last year, where there's seemingly a tension in the Gemara and throughout rabbinic teachings. On the one hand, we should not rely on miracles, but on the other hand, it's only Hashem that protects us from diseases. So if you study Torah, and if you daven, you'll be saved. That is really what saves you from disease. There's seemingly both opinions in the Talmud, but I think as modern Jews, we can, with the symmetry there, we can both do our best to avoid disease, but we can also make sure that we acknowledge that it's really only Hashem who saves us and protects us, and who is our shomer, who is our protector. In the Middle Ages, the rabbis of the Middle Ages realized that the epidemics had natural causes and that disease was contagious, augmenting the biblical and Talmudical view that these are the works of God, as I just mentioned. One of the most famous rabbis in the Middle Ages, the Ramban, Nachmanides in Spain in the 13th century. Listen to this. He writes, Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt to stop her blasphemous thoughts from spreading like the plague and infectious diseases that are carried in the air. So the Ramban already, who had a lot of medical knowledge, was already telling us that diseases are infectious and they spread in the airborne, they spread in the air. And that's why Lot's wife was turned into a pillar of salt. Otherwise, that she would have kept sending out her terrible thoughts, her blasphemous thoughts, like a disease that is airborne. Rabbi Bachia ben Asher, the Ramban's contemporary in Spain, another very famous rabbi of the Middle Ages, writes, this is also very interesting. During the plague caused by Korach's rebellion, Aaron separated Korach's company from the rest of the Israelites so that the bad air of the plague wouldn't stick to them. So after Korach, the rebellion of Korach, all those who participated in the rebellion and got the disease were separated. In the Middle Ages, there was this theory of disease called miasma, which was prevalent through the 19th century, in which disease was caused by polluting vapors in the air. You see over and over again that these terms became new to us this year. Who before 2020 even heard of the terms, if you weren't a virologist, who heard of the terms social distancing and shelter in place, right? But the Torah, the Talmud, the rabbis of the Middle Ages thought of this long before. There's in the Black Death, as I mentioned, it's thought that less Jews die in the Black Death. There's a famous story of Jacob of Padua, who was a chief physician in Dubrovnik in the mid-14th century. And after the first spasm of the Black Death, he established a site to house the sick beyond the city walls. And in 1377, the city passed a law stipulating a 30-day isolation period for travelers that in time Jacob of Padua, a religious Jew, boasted to 40 days. The 40 giorni, the quarantine. But why 40? So it's because of as we all know, the number 40 is so prevalent in Tanakh. Moses spends 40 solo days and nights on Mount Sinai. The Israelites wander for 40 years. We all know this. 40 days of the flood. Goliath taunts Israelites for 40 days. The spies spent 40 days counting Canaan. It's thought that Jacob of Padua changed the isolation period to 40 because of the Torah. This all just gives me an opportunity to just teach you one of my most famous, I'm very famous, and one of my most favorite teachings of Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers. Hu Hayal Mer Hillel used to say. So this very famously goes through your entire life. At 5 years of age, we study Torah. At 10, we study Mishnah. At 13, we're subject to the mitzvot. We're a bar mitzvah. At 15, we study Gemara. At 18, to the chuppah, to the wedding canopy. At 20, we find a parnasa. We pursue a livelihood. At 30, we have kaya. We have the peak of strength. At 40, we have bina. We have wisdom. 40 equals wisdom. That was another reason. At 50, eitzah, we can start giving advice. At 60, seva. And those times you didn't live as long as today, right? So 60, you're already seva. You're already old. At 70, 60 old, 70 la seva. 70, you were full. You had a full life. At Ben Shmonim la Gvura, at 80, if you lived till 80, you were a gibor, you were strong. Ben Tish'im la Shuach, if you were at 90, you were bent. Your body was bent. Ben Mea, and if you make it to 100, you're as good as dead. It's like you're completely gone from the world. It was so nice till we got to 100, right? That's why some people say, I don't want to live till 100, right? But you see how they thought. 40 was wisdom. So that was another reason why he ended it till 40. We'll skip this already. We'll skip. Rabbi Wolpe also talks about the number 40. I'm going to skip because I only have 3 more minutes to the rise of science. Rabbi Moshe Isserlis of the Ramah is one of the most famous rabbis of the last 500 years. He wrote all the Ashkenazic customs, so the Shulchan Aruch. Basically, all the Ashkenazic customs we have today were codified by him. And he was in Krakow, living in Krakow, and a man was trying to get out of a contract to rent an apartment because he found out the man's wife suffered from an infectious disease. And he was very upset. And he wrote, what he said that is an infectious disease is utter nonsense. And anyone who is moved by his heart says so, because it is the Lord who sickens and heals. If we found according to the opinion of the renter, then all laws concerning the visiting of the sick would be nullified, as we did not find anywhere a distinction between infectious disease and non-infection disease, except for the matter of one plagued by Ratam, which you discussed, who was not to be visited. So he's upset. He thinks you should visit someone, even if they have a quote-unquote infectious disease. But that's what he writes. But then he contradicts himself, because what does he write when he actually codifies the law in the Shulchan Aruch? He writes, one mustn't rely on miracles or risk his life. And he did, in fact, leave Krakow in 1555 when an epidemic started there. So you see the tension here. Is it just from Hashem? No, we still have to do everything in our own power. And there was a cholera outbreak in the 1830s. Rabbi Akiva Eger, again, one of the most famous commentators on the Talmud. Every student in yeshiva studies his commentary on the Talmud. He writes in Poland, we provide the following guidelines given the recommendation of the physician. So about all the shuls in Poland, he was the head rabbi in Poland. That gathering of large crowds, this is during cholera in the 1830s, for prolonged periods of time, leaving early on an empty stomach and breathing the sharp toxic air is likely to cause cholera. Furthermore, the fumes of oil lamps in the synagogues are harmful to one's health. All synagogues, including both the men's and women's sections, should fill to only half their seating capacity, such that every other seat is to be empty. By the way, you're going to see a lot of similarities that a lot of shuls did following his lead from 200 years ago. To allow for equal access during the high holidays, half the congregants will attend for 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, while the other half will attend for Yom Kippur, and they'll determine it by a lottery. A military guard should be posted at the synagogue entrance to maintain orderly seating. The length of the service should not exceed 5 hours. Each olel shall only have one mishaberach, no piyutim. The cantor should not prolong the prayers with melodies and musical flourishes. This is exactly what we did Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It was not anything new under the sun. It was done 200 years ago. Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, the founder of the Muslim movement, Rabbi Pearlson has told you this many times. This is a very famous thing that he did, and he did the following during Yom Kippur in 1848. 3 people who did not eat on any regular day of the week, but on Yom Kippur, and not just on any Yom Kippur, but on Yom Kippur that fell on Shabbat. They didn't eat in secret, but in front of everyone gathered in the great synagogue, including the rabbi himself. He ate on Yom Kippur. They weren't simple people or boors. They were princes of the community and their most important leaders, the rabbi of the city, Rabbi Salanter, and the 2 Dayanim, the rabbinic judges, who stood with him. He stood on the bima. You can read it according to this. And during the Musaf service, before the Musaf service, he made Kiddush on the bima on Yom Kippur, so that everyone in the shul would eat. It's 6:30, and we have mincha. So I just want to finish. During the Spanish flu, many shuls also closed, like ours did. But I want to finish on a very bright note. Listen to this. If we look at many of the stories that we encountered after every single plague, after every epidemic, when society came to a halt or life came to a halt, there was always a light. Things always got better. After Noach and his family sheltered in place for a year in the ark, Noach became the father of all the nations of the world. After Jacob sheltered in the home of his uncle Lavan to escape Esau, Jacob emerged 20 years later with a new family, new wealth, new identity. He became Israel. After Joseph was sheltered for 13 years in slavery in prison, God used this to prepare him for greatness, to save his people from famine. After Moshe sheltered in a remote desert, God used Moshe to free the people. After God sheltered Naomi in the barren land of Moab, which we read about on Shavuot, she and her daughter-in-law Ruth traveled to Bethlehem and participated in great love. After God sheltered Esther in place of the Persian king, Esther saved her Jewish people from destruction. And finally, when 3,333 years ago today, yes, the count is exactly 3333. We got the Torah 3,333 years ago. Today, our great-great-great-great-grandparents received the Torah. It didn't bring the story to a neat and tidy ending. It was just the beginning. The pandemic won't have a neat and tidy ending either. There are losses we won't ever get over. Many of us will be hurting for a long time. But with each passing day we have counted the Omer, it feels like it is getting better. It feels like we have a long summer day of warmth and life awaiting us. When our biblical heroes reemerge and join society, Hashem bless them. We await Hashem's blessing too. Amen and good yontif to everybody.
Amen, amen.
Amen.
Listen, I bet you, Rabbi Josh, tonight before Yontif, like everyone's going to go out now and buy a lottery ticket, 33.
Yes, yes. 3 and 33 on your lottery ticket.
All
Exactly.
multiples. Very good. So before we daven mincha, let's quickly count the Omer. Please join me. Hayom Tisha V'Abarim Yom Shehem Shiva Shavuot LaOmer. Today is the 49th day of the Omer, which is exactly 7 weeks of the Omer. Harachamanu Yachazir Lanu Avodat Beit HaMikdash L'Kama B'Mira B'Yameinu Amen Salah.
Amen.
Hashem return us speedily to the Holy Temple and rebuild it and return us to our worship there. Amen.
Amen.
So we now continue with Ashrei. If you have your own Siddur, and Ashrei is found on page 232.
Ashrei Yoshei Beitecha Od Yalu Chasela V'choyu V'barchecha V'lashichanu Menadu Poteach et yadecha maspia lechol charatzon tzaddik ganem b'chol racha v'chas v'chol ma'aseh Tila Adonai Yaber Pivi Vare Kol Basar Shimkat Shoyelam Voed Vanachnu Nevarech Yom Yatavi Adolam Hallelujah.
These guys join Rabbi Josh. We're on page 234. This is regular Amida.
Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu v'le'avoteinu le'Abraham le'Yitzchak le'Yaakov El v'Yanora El Elyon Chasadim Tovim v'Konei Yaakov v'Zocher Chasdi Avot U'Mevi Goel Livnei B'neihem Leman Shemo B'Yava Melech Ozer Moshiach Magin Baruch Atah Adonai Magin Avraham Atah Givei Mechaim Mitim Atah Rabbi Yoshia Marit Atah Mechal Chaim Chesed Mechamitim Rachamim Rabim Samech Nofim Rabbi Chalim Matir Asurim Mekayim Menatali Sheni Afar Michavach Amarod Midom Elach Melech Memit Mechayeh Umatzmiach Yeshua V'Ne'eman Atalach Yametim Baruch Atah Adonai Mechayeh Yametim Atah Kadosh V'Shimcha Kadosh Odoshim B'chol Yom Yalu Chasela Baruch Atah Adonai Oel HaKadosh.
On completion of your meet, I'd like to invite you all to join us for Aleinu, which is found on the bottom of 252.
Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon ha'kol ha'tegedula l'yotzer breshit shelo asanu goyi haratzon velo samanu gmishachot adama shelo sam chelkeinu kahem v'gor aleinu gechol amonam v'anachnu korim משתחווים ומודים לבני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed v'ne'emar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz v'yom ha'hu yeh Adonai echad u'shemo echad.
Mourners Kaddish.
Rabbi, remember we're gonna.
Yes, thank you, Freddie. Thank you.
Rabbi Pearlson gave me permission to read the names on the Your Side list tonight for the next 3 days. We don't want any person on the list to be forgotten. We want everybody to be remembered. So tomorrow, on the first day of Shavuot, we remember Dora Eppelbaum, Evelyn Rafael, Leon Motola, Matilde Bazan, Paul Goldman, and Yenta Kozolchik. On Tuesday, the second day of Shavuot, we remember Barbara Rosenblatt, Mayor Fiverr Kozolchik, and Mrs. Sylvia. On Wednesday, the 8th day of Sivan, we remember Abraham Levy and Eli Sinai. That's it.
Join us now for Mourners Kaddish, page 254.
Yitkadal,
Amen. Mayo.
Barach v'yishtabach v'yifar v'yinaseh.
Beisnase.
Yishadar
Yishadar, Beisalel,
v'yishtabach
Beisalach.
Shemei
Meir
Kushav
Kushav. Brehu.
Meir
Chata.
Chata Shush v'chata v'nechemata
Nehemata.
Amira v'yama v'imru amen
Yamo. Vibru. Amen.
Yehi Shalom Rav Amishemaya Hayim
Hayim
Aleinu
Aleinu.
V'Kol
Yavol
Yisrael
Israel.
Amen
Vibru. Amen.
Say Shalom Irav Yaseh Shalom
Shalom.
Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael
Vibru. Amen.
Amen. This evening, excuse me, candle lighting is at 7:41. That's when the holiday of Shavuot begins. You make 2 blessings on your candles, Alad Liknir Shel Yom Tov and a Shechianu. Tomorrow night, candle lighting is at 7:42. Same thing, we light from pre-existing flame. You also light your Yortzeit candle tonight for purpose of using it tomorrow night to light your Yom Tov candles and your Yortzeit candles. Quick announcement before I begin my class that tomorrow and Tuesday is Yontif, and we have services for 90 minutes. We still have the beautifully condensed services that start at 10 a.m. They're over at 11:30, Monday and Tuesday. And Tuesday is also Yizkor. So if you'd like to recite Yizkor tonight, as well as Tuesday in Minyan in Shul, we'd love to see you. So let me explain to you what we're going to be studying tonight. I received a lot of requests trying to, people very upset what's going on in Israel, very upset. And I was amazed that no matter how much people read and pay attention to the news, I don't think, based on their questions, that people really have an understanding of what the fighting is really about. So please join me. I'm going to talk fast. And afterwards, God willing, I'll even have a few minutes for questions before we recite Yizkor. So let's begin. The first question is it appropriate time and place on Shavuot to talk politics? And the answer is, we're not talking politics. This is about defending our people and defending our land of Israel. I'm not talking politics. It's about rockets and riots, about lies and deceits, and how we as Jews can defend our people in Israel and make sure that our fellow Jews are safe. On Shavuot, yes, on Shavuot, this is a perfect time. It says that we encamped, it says in the Torah, and the children of Israel, he encamped at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. And what happened was, Rashi says it's in the singular. What does it mean? And the children of Israel, he encamped. And the rabbis explained, very beautiful, that we were, Rashi said, we were lev echad ki ish echad. We were one heart and one people. So if we are one heart and one people, we have to make sure that we feel united with Israel and that we absolutely protect them and make sure that they are safe. Shavuot is also the holiday of the land. It is the holiday of harvest, the land of Israel. It's about the harvesting of the land of Israel, making sure the land of Israel is safe. And lastly, it says Torah Yisrael, anniversary of giving the Torah of Israel, Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and Eretz Yisrael, Chadhu, which means the Torah of Israel, the people of Israel, and the land of Israel are all one entity. It's a 3-legged stool. And if you think that we could survive without Israel, you're mistaken. And that's why we have to study these things like we're studying here tonight to make sure that each and every one of us can do whatever is necessary for the land of Israel. Now, why the riots and war? Why is it happening now? And the answer is every single year during Ramadan, their holy month, there is religious fervor and there's frequently, not every year, but frequently, a lot of rioting and a lot of posturing in the streets, and there's always problems during Ramadan. It's sort of like my father, may rest in peace, to say, the days before Easter and the days after Easter in Bialystok, Jews did not go out at night. It was their holy time, and they were always looking for an excuse to beat up Jews. And that's what happens during Ramadan. Jerusalem municipal courts, this is the second reason why it happened now. The municipal court had a court case brought to them 9 times over the last 50 years to evict Palestinian residents, and the court deemed it was illegal. They were living there illegally on Jewish-owned land in an area that they call Sheikh Jarrah. It was, the court refused to let the Palestinians stay. And what happened was it's actually going to the Israeli Supreme Court, and all of this was coming to a head. The other thing was that last week we were celebrating Jerusalem Day. And yes, the Israelis, the Jews in Jerusalem have parties and what do you call it? And marches and the street parties. And this was going on each evening at the same exact time that Ramadan, in the religious fervor of Ramadan. So all of these things was like what they call in English a perfect storm. Israeli Supreme Court delayed hearing on the case because of these rising tensions. So they thought it would make things better. It turned out it made things worse. Lastly, number 5, the PA leader, Mahmoud Abbas, PA stands for the Palestinian Authority, abruptly canceled the election scheduled this month. He is in 15 years into a 4-year term, and he canceled them. This further enraged the Palestinians. Hamas inspired and encouraged the violence on the street to portray itself as the defender of Jerusalem. Hamas miscalculated the instability of the Israeli political arena, which would work in its favor. As you know, Israel had a 4th election, and for the 4th time, a government was not be able to be seated. And Hamas thought that they would be able to run havoc and do all these crazy things, and that the government wouldn't be strong enough to respond. And they judged Israel incorrect. What is Hamas demanding right now? 1, released all those detained in recent riots. It's about 400 people. And who are the people that were detained? Well, let's give you an example. Number 2, no Israelis allowed to enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque. First of all, no Israelis have ever entered the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It's just never happened. Okay, there are very few Jews that even go up to the Temple Mount. But what happened was 2 weeks ago, this is how it all started, they were rioting up on the Temple Mount, and they were throwing huge rocks onto the people that were praying at the Western Wall. And the Israelis had to go in there, and that day alone, they arrested 90 rioters. An Israeli police officer was severely injured by rocks. And I'm not talking about pebbles. We're talking about huge pieces of concrete, the size of large softballs. Now, in addition to that, over the last 7 days, an additional 300 people. So there's over 400 to 500 people who are arrested. They all have to be set free. That's their first demand. Second demand is a crazy one. Jews not allowed into Al-Aqsa Mosque. Jews never go into the mosque. And that no eviction of the families from the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Now, I'm going to intermittently call it Sheikh Jarrah because that's what the world is calling it. And it's named after a sheikh, which means a tribal leader who was buried there. His name was Jarrah. And that's why it's called the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood. Now, the real reason many people believe that why is this all occurring now and what's going on? It's a showdown between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. You see, in East Jerusalem, that's the best arena for Hamas to flex its muscles, since it shows the Arab street that Hamas has a higher concern for defending the Islamic holy sites and the Arab residents than the Palestinian Authority. And it's Hamas, which is usually restricted to Gaza, they're the ones that are now taking over these Arab neighborhoods, and especially in Jerusalem, Lod, Ramla, even parts of Yafa, Akko, and Haifa. Now, what happened? Hamas has succeeded in embarrassing the PA and Abbas by portraying them as incapable of defending Jerusalem and its holy sites. Hamas has challenged Israel's claim to Jerusalem, presented an ultimatum to Israel: either you withdraw the forces from Temple Mount or else. This is a new development because Hamas's arena was only previously in Gaza. Now, as we mentioned, they're on the street inside the Judah and Samaria, what's called the West Bank. Hamas initiated violence has put a halt to the Israeli integration into the ruling government with the participation of Arab parties in the political arena. As you probably know, it looked as if there was going to be a government made by the center and center-left parties, and some say it was even Netanyahu. It was going to be a government made with the Arab minority parties. Now, the Hamas had to put an end to that. You can't have a government, Hamas says, with Arabs, because then how could you call Israel an apartheid state if the Arab parties are a member of the Israeli government leading the country? So they had to make sure that the rioting would put an end to that. And by the way, there is no way now that any Arab parties would ever be invited into an Israeli government. It's not going to happen now because there's so much heat between Jews and Arab on the street, it will never happen. And in that regard, Hamas has won. Now, this is proof of the premise that we just discussed. This is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And what you see here, for the first time ever, you don't see the heroes being portrayed as Yasser Arafat or Abbas. These are the 4 leaders of Hamas, not the PA, in front of the Dome of the Rock on May 13th. This huge banner, and look carefully, not one Palestinian flag. What do you see instead? Look carefully. You see those green flags? Those aren't Palestinian flags in front of Al-Aqsa Mosque. That's Hamas flags in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, where you used to see Palestinian flags. You now see Hamas flags. Now, again, Hamas used to be restricted to Gaza. Now we see what's really going on. This is a picture of a mob scene at the Temple Mount last Friday before the riots. Okay. So let's get to the next step. So what exactly is Sheikh Jarrah? So what happens is Sheikh Jarrah is an Arab name of a historically Jewish neighborhood called Shimon HaTzadik. Now Shimon HaTzadik was one of the Tanaim from the Talmud who lived 350 BCE. So that means his burial, we know where he's buried, this is it. He was buried there 1,350 years ago. That's where he's buried. A small Jewish community lived there until 1948, until Jordan forced them out. But more importantly, the Jewish community, led by mostly Yemenites, bought the property from the Ottomans legally in 1875. And we have those documents from the Ottoman Empire that proved it was ours. There's a Jewish home overlooking the burial cave of Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik. This is a photograph taken in 1916. Before World War I was officially over. Now, in 1967, we took control of it back, and a 50-year-long property dispute has been raging over the small 7 houses on the 4 acres that surround the grave of Rabbi Shimon HaTzadik. It's only 4 acres. Okay, that's approximately what we'd say in Miami Beach, about 12 houses. Okay, now here's a picture of that very same area. It's the Shepherd's Hotel, circa 1940, proving that there were no Arab buildings in the vicinity. You know, they say, oh, there was a city there. There was no city there. Oh, there was a village there. No, this was a mansion built by the Mufti of Jerusalem. It's not on Jewish land, right? At that time, it was not Jewish land, but he never lived in it. And he let a British person that had been disposed, she lived in it during World War II. But here's the amazing thing. It was purchased in 1982 by a Miami Beach millionaire by the name of Dr. Moskowitz. The owner, he paid something like a ridiculous sum of money for it. The Arab owner, who did get the purchase price, disappeared. You know why? Because he knew that the Arabs would kill him for selling it. And the Arab lives someplace in Australia, we understand, but the whole proof of this picture is there were no Arabs living there. There was no village. There was no one to displace. This is the proof. It's been brought to numerous civil courts in the last 50 years and appellate processes. And each time evidence proved that it is a Jewish-owned property for over 150 years. Ownership and property deeds were obtained during the Ottoman rule in 1875 and were uncontested until 1948, not until 1967. Nobody contested it. Everyone knew it was Jewish property. It was even registered in the Ottoman land registry to the Jewish community. Now, this is actually what Shimon HaTzadik's grave looks like now. We had to put a gate on it because the Arabs used to come in and deliberately desecrate the area. I'm not going to tell you how they did it, but I'm sure you can imagine the disgusting thing they would do at night. The court agreement, there was an agreement by the court. They're both equally displeased. The Jewish litigants were displeased because the Arabs were not kicked out of the property. The Arabs were displeased because they had to pay rent, whereas before they were squatters, they didn't have to. The Arabs paid rent as agreed for a few years, and then they stopped, claiming they had been forced, they'd been coerced in signing the document. So the process returned to the Supreme Court. 4 times appealed, even to higher courts, each time denied. It is now going to go to the Supreme Court. And this is what they're fighting over. It's all about a civil dispute over the ownership of 12 houses, an area that could be for 12 houses. Now, the same court that they're complaining about that found in favor of the Jews in this case, 45% of the time they side with Arabs. This particular time, the court didn't side with Arabs. Now, if you take into consideration that Arabs are only 20% of the general population, that means the court is siding in favor of Arabs twice as much as statistically they should be. Okay, but this one case, the Arabs didn't get their way, and now what are they doing? Now they're screaming and yelling. It's not about politics. It's about squatters and the legal system. This isn't a political issue. It's about someone refusing to pay rent, people refusing to leave Jewish property, and the Jews want their property back. International pressure was mounting for the state to overturn the 5 court rulings based on the ethnicity of the party and not legal status. Can you imagine if someone said to a judge, yeah, we know that you sided 4 times with the white guy, but we need you to side now with the black guy because we don't want to riot because he's black. Well, justice is justice, right is right, and that's the issue here. So now the rioting has been in what's called mixed communities. And for not 50 years, but for hundreds of years, Jews have gotten along quite well in Akko, in Yafo, in Ramla, in Lud, in cities like that. And that is now, these are mixed cities. And this is where the craziness has been going on. Mayor Yair Revivo, he is from Lud. Lud is right near the airport. In fact, before it was called Tel Aviv, it was called Lud Airport. This is what he said. This is Kristallnacht in Lud. Synagogues have been burned, hundreds of cars set alight, hundreds of Arab thugs are roaming the streets. Here's a picture of cars in a Jewish neighborhood that were set afire by rioters, but only Jewish cars were set aflame. Arab neighbors knew who owned each car. So you should know that there were Arabs and Jews living on the same street, but only the Jewish cars were set afire. This is in Akko. A Jewish-owned van was torched. In the background is a Muslim minaret, and it's left a Christian church. So again, they're targeting only Jews. And the problem is that these people have lived together. They're families of neighbors who have lived together for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm not saying hundreds and hundreds as a statement of exaggeration, but literally, you have Jewish communities that have been living side by side. This is a horrible scene. It should make everyone cry. This is a synagogue in Lud that was torched by the crowd, knowingly, willingly, deliberately. They didn't torch like the courthouse. They didn't torch the municipality. They went after a religious institution. This might be a political issue, but they deliberately torched the synagogue. Now, miraculously, the Torahs didn't catch fire, and you see them here carrying the Torahs out of the building. I'd like to talk about the severe lies and about the injuries and the deaths in Gaza. So we know for a fact, one of the interesting things, rockets fired by Hamas towards Israel fell short at in Gaza, killing 17 residents. The only thing was, it couldn't have been, they're claiming that Israel killed those first 17 residents. The only fact is, we can document it, it is documented. Israel didn't start firing back for another 2.5 hours. So all those deaths that they claim, the 17 initial deaths, it couldn't have been the IDF because the IDF didn't start the air war yet. Of the 1,750, now, by the way, it's over 2,400 missiles now, but when I wrote this, of the 1,700 missiles fired into Israel, more than 350 of them were errant rockets and fell on Arab-populated areas. That means 20% of all the rockets land in Gaza. Since fired from civilian areas, casualties are closest to the launch sites. Now, Israel documented that there is at least 3 rockets that blew up on the launch pad and killed a number of people because, you know, these are basically homemade rockets. They're not NASA. It's not the United States Air Force. They're homemade. They're made in makeshift bomb factories. They're not and they're not guided missiles. And that's why they go up depending on air temperature, wind resistance, current weather conditions. They can go 30 miles, they can go 50 miles, and there's no way to true aim them. Now, it's a fact in 2014, explosions at the Al-Shifa hospital and the Al-Shati refugee camp was blamed initially on Israel. That 72 people were killed in these 2 episodes. It was later proven to be caused by Palestinian misfires from the roofs nearby. Okay? Now, it did take 9 months before they accepted the Israeli proof, but for 9 months, we were baby killers. Because there's a process, you know, we don't make, blatant statements. There was an investigation, even the United Nations accepted that Israel wasn't at fault. But until it happens, 9 months later, all the bad press, we're baby killers, we kill pregnant women, it's horrible, we blow up schools. It's all lies. Now, a failed Hamas rocket fell short Tuesday, destroying power lines, cutting off 230,000 residents from electricity. And they're blaming Israel. It was a Palestinian Hamas rocket that landed in Gaza. It wasn't an Israel. Listen, Israel can, you know what Israel does? They bomb things within 9 square feet, 3 meters. Do you think that we would make a mistake and blow up the electricity? Because guess who's going to have to pay for it? And guess who had to fix it last time? Do you think we would deliberately blow up an electric power line grid that we're going to have to pay for? It's ridiculous. No, let me get this straight. We do something called roof knocking. They drop duds on roofs. It's called knocking on the roof. And then we make phone calls. And I'll show you in a few minutes if we have time. We do everything to get the civilians out, but we deliberately blow up a power grid that we're going to have to rebuild. All lies. And we have to know these things so we can defend Israel. One of my favorite ones that came out is the explosion of the AP, the Associated Press Media Tower. It was a tall building. Their journalists never reported rockets launched right next door to their building. They were right there. This was their Gaza headquarters. Illegal rockets being shot off from residential area, which is against all international rules, and they never reported it. They claimed they didn't know the first 3 floors were leased by Hamas. Let me get this straight. They claim to know what's going on in Israel, but they don't know what's going on in their own building? It's crazy. So now let's talk real quickly about the U.S. international response. Does anyone recognize this guy? This is Hadi Amir. He's the Deputy Assistant Undersecretary of State for Israel and Palestinian Affairs. He's President Biden's special envoy. So let me explain to you why I'm not exactly overly impressed. Let me make sure you understand where Hadi Amir is in the hierarchy. So what's the hierarchy? First, there's a Secretary of State. Then there's Deputy Secretary of State. Then there's the Undersecretary of State. Then there's the Assistant Undersecretary of State. And then there's the Deputy Assistant Undersecretary of State. That's who President Biden sent. Now, compare that when there were problems in the Middle East. Well, I just took 3 that I think everyone can remember because honestly, I don't remember the specifics of the other people. Compared this to President Nixon, who sent Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. President Clinton sent Colin Powell, Secretary of State Colin Powell, and Obama even sent a special envoy, Senator George Mitchell. Okay, I'm not too upset about this, by the way. You know why? Because if this guy, Hadi Amir, is unable to make a timely concession on both parts, gives Israel more time to do what it has to do, rather than, can you imagine being forced by international pressure to stop what we have to do too soon. I think I have 5 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is give you an example of the extreme media misinformation campaign. This was found on the AP website. I don't get newspapers anymore, but this is what I found on the AP website. It's by an Arab by the name of Faris Akram, who is the AP head journalist in Gaza. Okay, so he tells this, first of all, this is news. This is supposed to be journalism. And listen to how the way he talks. The airstrike Saturday came roughly an hour after the Israeli military ordered people to evacuate the building. Do you hear that? Roughly, and he admits it, an hour after the Israelis ordered them to evacuate the building. There was no immediate explanation for why the building was targeted. Okay, so what do they need? They need an explanation? They warned you, we're going to blow up the building. You got an hour to get out. By the way, I'm going to say this a couple times. How many hours does the average Israeli get that their rocket is coming towards them? Do you know? 40 to 80 seconds. When the sirens go off, you have 40 to 80 seconds, not an hour. Let's go on. Israelis knew that the residents of the building, Hamas was using entire floors for terrorists. They didn't know. The AP journalists didn't know in their own building. 3 floors, three stories with nothing but Hamas, but Israelis knew it in Tel Aviv. Okay, so now watch the timeline. It was at 1:55 p.m. on Saturday. Okay, and he's telling how he was sleeping and he got woke up. Someone was banging on the door. He had to leave. He had a brief advance warning, 5 minutes. They had taken out 3 buildings so far that week, warning residents and occupants sometimes only minutes before they had to get out. That's not true, but let's say it is. I was told you have 10 minutes. 10 minutes starting at 1:55. Yet in the headline, he admits it was an hour. Now let's go on. So it says that he grabbed what he needed, decorative photos, whatever it is, he took it all, right? Then it says he jumped into his car. It was after 2 p.m. I looked around, I was the last person there. So he left the building within 5 minutes from a dead sleep. Okay, I'm pretty impressed. This proves Israel gave enough time to escape. 5 minutes is enough. Israel is only at 40 to 80 seconds to find shelter. Then guess what? He gets into his car and he runs away. Now this is what he says about the building. My office, I thought the place that I thought was sacrosanct and would go untargeted because both AP and Al Jazeera offices were located on its top floors, is now a pile of rubble and girders and dust. Sacrosanct means this is why Hamas placed their office there, as a human and political shield. It's the equivalent of putting their guns and their weapons in a school, because they know that Israel's never going to blow up the AP journalists. And that's why they deliberately rented the same office space. Let's skip down. Nearby, our building owner was on the phone with the Israeli military officer who had told him to get the place evacuated. Do you understand that? Look up, first of all, how amazing is Israel. They had the building homeowner's telephone number. The owner of the building was being warned by the Israeli government, we're blowing up your building, get everyone out. The homeowner was begging for a bit more time. No, by the way, if you want, I'll send this to you. The journalists admit that he got into his car and they drove like 10 minutes. So now he's 20 minutes away from when they said the building's going to blow up. Okay, they're all there together. Okay, he still wanted more times, but they were 20 minutes away. Why did he want more time? You know why he wanted more time? So that the terrorists, Hamas terrorists, could remove whatever they needed from the offices. Why else would they need? They're all out of the building. It's 20 minutes. This is the second 10-minute warning. That proves that Israel did give additional evacuation time. So the whole idea, he wasn't even near the building. They were 20 minutes away. Why was he asking for more time? Everyone was out of the building because they were all in it together and they all were doing their best to ensure that Hamas gets saved and that they save face. Now, the last thing, well, not the last thing, but In my pocket, I still had a key to a room that no longer exists. Now, this is a blatant shout out to Palestinians, a nuance missed by Westerners. Palestinians, whenever you see them go to a demonstration, the grandmothers are shaking old-fashioned skeleton keys. That's their proof that they they were kicked out of their houses and they took the keys with them and they're waiting to get back to their houses. And that's that's shout out. It's a very famous Palestinian thing. It's like the way we think of a mezuzah. You know, you leave a house in Cuba, you might have taken your mezuzah with you. And every time you look at the mezuzah, right, it's supposed to remind you of what you gave up. That's what they claim. And that's what this whole tiny key was all about. He admits that no people were hurt from his building. And this is what I think is hysterical. He writes, "We, the journalists, are not the story." This article proves just the opposite. When he says the AP has it on their website, not under opinions, but rather alongside the news updates. It's a very disturbing thing that he's telling all the story about, you know, what happened to him as if it's news. I'm going to end on this. This is one of the most dynamic pictures I saw. What you see here are the rockets incoming from Gaza towards Ashkelon, and the Israeli Iron Dome about to knock them all out. Unfortunately, not all of the rockets are knocked out, and unfortunately, as we know, that a minimum of 9 Israelis have been killed, including a small child. And we mourn the loss of every death, even Palestinian deaths, because as far as I'm concerned, my personal opinion,